Assalamu alaikum. Um, Welcome to this video on the topic of is Islam a religion of war or peace? Actually, the title is taken from my most recent book, which has just been published on Amazon, and you can find it there. This video is intends to introduce that book to people, whoever may take an interest in it. I have some additional books on Amazon, and I also have some academic papers on two academic sites. One is Academia, where my papers are listed under my legal name, which is Leslie Terabesi, and my papers are also listed on ResearchGate. However, here the here the listing is under my Muslim name, which is Abdul Karim Abdullah. So today I briefly want to talk about the content of that book. That book is actually a result of some years of struggling with this question. I worked at an Islamic university from 2002 until 2007, and after that I worked at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, both here in Malaysia. And after I left the institute in 2017, towards the end of the year, I still had some questions that I was I was looking for answers to. And so some of the research that I have done after I left the institute represent, and which I have been publishing independently, basically under the label of my foundation, which is Terabisi Foundation. And so these papers that I have written since I have left the institute constitute an attempt to come to grips with those remaining issues that I still that were still on my mind when I left the institute, and I wanted, of course, some answers first and foremost for myself. However, I was in a habit of writing ideas down, so I continued to write down my, as it were, investigations or explorations of these questions in different papers, which were first published on the academic websites, which I mentioned already, and later they were published and continue to be republished on Amazon.com, as most of them as relatively small books, although there are a few of them there that are bigger in size, so to speak, say more than 200 pages. However, so to come back to the main topic, among the main concerns that I had were the doctrine of abrogation. Then there was the question of jihad, and also the question of the relationship between the Quran and Sunnah, or actually, more broadly speaking, the relationship between the top four, what are known in Islamic studies as the roots of the Sharia, meaning the Quran, the Sunnah, the Ijma or consensus of the scholars, and the effort of the individual jurist, the faqih, which is known as ijtihad. I felt that something happened in the course of Muslim intellectual history and political history, I might add, and I wasn't quite sure what that was. Of course, I have read Bernard Lewis' paper on what went wrong. I think it was published in the Atlantic. You may still find it online. And I think he made some valid points, such as, for example, when he said that there was not enough freedom in the Muslim world, and that was one of the problems that caused or accelerated its fall into backwardness. However, I felt the problem was deeper than that. I felt that there was some kind of an alienation from of the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim community, from the very source which gave it strength and prominence in the first place, and that was none other than the revelation of the Quran itself. So, one of the first papers I have written on the subject was called The Eclipse of Revelation by Tradition. I think there's a book by that title there already on Amazon.com. And from then on, my investigation proceeded in two directions, as it were, at the same time, more or less, both forward and backward, so to speak. When I went forward, I was trying to work out the consequences of this eclipse of revelation of the Quran by the tradition or the hadith. I use the terms hadith and sunnah in al-Shafi's sense here, considering as if they were the same, although of course we know they are not the same. And just very briefly, I could say the difference between a sunnah and a hadith is that the real sunnah of the Prophet was in following the Quran, but the sunnah as traditionally understood consists in following the sunnah in a traditional sense as it is understood by many traditional conservative Muslims today. Following the sunnah entails following the books of hadith, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and four other books of hadith. So now, of course, there's a certain difference here, and in fact, I explored that difference in another book of mine. I think it's called Sunnah and Hadith. What are the differences? But now to come back to the main question, as I said, I felt there was something that happened that perhaps should not have happened, and I concluded, as I mentioned earlier, that this event that basically initiated, or perhaps I should say accelerated, the decline of the Muslim Ummah was this alienation from revelation, the alienation from source, the original source of the strength and preeminence of the Ummah, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this alienation from the Quran has been kind of predicted in the Quran, where there's a verse where the Prophet, peace be on him, will allegedly say on the day of accountability that will say, "Oh my Lord, my people have abandoned this Quran." So, has the Quran been abandoned or not? And if so, what extent and what exactly is the relationship between the Quran and other sources of Islam or other sources of the Sharia? So after I began to work out the consequences or the effects of this turn from revelation to tradition, from the Quran to the Hadith, I also worked backwards to try to identify the reasons why this happened. So, and in the process, I realized that there was a whole series of events or causes and effects, if you like, that basically culminated at the end of the process in a fairly major transformation of our understanding of revelation. And this transformation could be perhaps summed up by saying that what we witness in Muslim intellectual and to an extent political history is what I have called the transformation of the religion of peace, as it is explained in the Quran, into a religion of war, as it is explained in writings of a particular class of ulama, not all ulama, I hasten to add, but as it is expressed in the writings and works of the ulama that have accepted and endorsed the doctrine of abrogation, including the abrogation of 120 peace verses by one or two of the so-called verses of the sword. I am referring to verse 5 and verse 29 in Surah number 9. So, our knowledge of the teaching of the Quran, as I'm suggesting, has been transformed from understanding Islam as a religion of peace to misunderstanding it as a religion of war. Now, when I say this, I'm not blaming all the ulama for this articulation of the message of Islam, only those, as I mentioned, which accepted the doctrine of the abrogation of the peace verses by the verses of the sword, and which accordingly also adopted two or three other principles that kind of go together with this notion of the abrogation of the peace verses by the sword verses. And these other principles or beliefs include the belief that the world is divided into two parts, basically the Darul Islam, or the domain of peace, and the Darul Harb, or the domain of war. Now, this articulation of the clash between the Darul Islam and the Darul Harb, or the Darul Kufr, or the abode of disbelief, as it is sometimes also called, is quite similar to a doctrine articulated recently in the West by Samuel Huntington in his book called The Clash of Civilizations. It seems that the doctrine of the clash of civilizations was already present in the Muslim world a millennium before it emerged in the work of, or re-emerged, I should say, in the work of Samuel Huntington. So the other notion that was part of this, acceptance of or reinterpretation of Islam as a religion of war was the adoption of a new understanding of military jihad. And this new understanding basically transformed the Quranic understanding of military jihad, which was that military jihad is permitted, yes, but only in self-defense and in fighting against oppression. Nowhere does the Quran authorize any kind of offensive jihad or aggressive jihad, as some of the more militant ulama were to argue later on. Now, this aggressive or offensive jihad is also known as jihad al-talab, and a number of writers have written on this subject, including Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who in his book called Fiqh al-Jihad, or the Jurisprudence of Jihad, published in 2009, argues that the doctrine of jihad al-talab, or the offensive jihad, was actually not something that is consistent with the teaching of the Quran. In other words, he is sort of backpedaling on this entire doctrine of Jihad al-Talab, which, by the way, requires, according to its supporters, the Muslim community to wage war on non-Muslims once a year, every year, and even when these non-Muslims are not attacking the Muslims. All right, so I repeat, Jihad al-Talab, as the more militant ulama have argued or articulated it, requires the Muslim community to wage war against non-Muslims once a year, every year, even when the non-Muslims are not attacking the Muslim community. So you can see that there's a huge difference here between the kind of military jihad permitted in Al-Quran, which is jihad in self-defense. You can see that the militant ulama are now arguing in favor of the offensive or aggressive jihad, jihad al-talab, which goes very clearly and entirely against the Quranic teaching on the military jihad. So now you may be wondering, how did this happen and what went wrong, as I have been wondering. And I think I can offer some thoughts by way of explaining what transpired and how it transpired. You can judge for yourself as to how accurate, these reflections are. There's, of course, always room for improvement, and all this is, of course, always also work in progress. So if I don't get everything right, please, as we say in Canada, give me some slack, and perhaps you could even put the whole scenario together better yourself and make your own YouTube video and explain, perhaps better than I can or I have, as to what exactly transpired here. But I see some of the problems that we are encountering currently in modernity, stemming partly as a result of this misarticulation of the relationship between the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community, because this relationship has been articulated by the militant ulama as a relationship of hostility. They seem to, take it for granted that there's this irreconcilable clash and conflict between the Islamic civilization and, for example, the West. And by the way, I have another book on that. I think it's called Islam and the West. And of course, they write and argue accordingly. However, I think this is an oversimplification to see the world in such terms, in binary terms, in black and white, us and them. There are a lot of gray areas. I'm not saying that there are no fundamental and important differences. Of course, there are such differences. But these differences should not be exaggerated. To me, Islam is quite an inclusive religion. However, some of these ulama, I refer to them as militant ulama, the supporters or advocates of Jihad al Talab. And among them, I could perhaps mention one contemporary name that was Said Ramadan al Bouti, who is on record for saying that holy war, in the sense of Jihad al Talab, is still valid, and he is one of the ulama who subscribes to the abrogation of 120 peace verses by verse number 5 in Surah number 9. Unfortunately, a few years ago, he himself died in a bomb blast, so I'm not sure whether this is, how do I put this, karma, or the idea that, as people say, what goes around comes around. But anyway, he's certainly not alone in believing that we Muslims we are required by Allah Ta'ala to spread Islam by word and by sword if necessary. Now, here is the problem. Was Islam spread by the word or by the sword, if you want to put the question that way? I think the short answer is both, because there were a lot of many peaceful preachers, and there are many of them until this day. But there were also times when Jihad al Talab was put into practice, and I would hasten to add that my understanding is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, never ever waged aggressive war. All the wars in which he participated and in which he was a leader were defensive in nature, without exception. It was only after his passing that some of the leaders of the Muslim community embarked on this idea and adopted this idea of offensive jihad or jihad al talab and acted accordingly. You can find a very interesting account of this in a book by Muhammad Shahrur in chapter 6, which is on politics, where he goes into this. And the name of the book is Quran, Morality, and Critical Reason. And the book was published in 2009 in Damascus, Syria, and it was a best selling book. Of course, it also aroused a fair bit of controversy, and I think there are about 22 traditional ulama who have written rebuttals to his, ideas about this particular topic and other related themes. However, I certainly recommend the book highly. As far as I can tell, it is the best book so far that I have been able to come across that addresses the issues facing the Muslim Ummah in a credible manner. And he does not hesitate to, as it were, take the bull by the horns, and he certainly doesn't beat around the bush, as the saying goes, which is something which is not unheard of in academic circles, where we find that the ulama hesitate to touch on certain subjects and consider them almost as taboo subjects. And so these problems just continue to fester. They are often sometimes swept under the carpet, and they are not being addressed, and so it means that in the long term they are just going to get bigger and worse. And one of those problems, as we have seen and we know very well, is the problem of extremism. And how shall I put this? Even terrorism, because of course, while terrorist acts are not all and always perpetrated by persons that claim to be Muslims, in some cases they are. So where do these people get the idea that it is okay? I mean, the extremists and the terrorists who claim to act in the name of Islam, where do they get the idea that they have the right to be judge, jury, and executioner and to take the law into their own hands and attack people, sometimes individuals that they don't like, or pronounce on them fatwas of apostasy and what have you, which is equivalent to a death sentence, basically? Where do they get these notions? And I think the short answer is that they get it from certain, they don't get it from the Quran, but they get it from another source. And that other source is the some of the problematic traditions. For example, the tradition which says that the Prophet allegedly said, I was sent to fight people and nas until they all say La ilaha illallah. Now, that is a very general statement and seems to lend support to the doctrine of Jihad al Talab. Another example is another tradition attributed to the Prophet. And the tradition says that God bless Prophet Muhammad, who was sent with the sword, I repeat, with the sword as a mercy to mankind. End of quote. Now, this is a hadith or a tradition, which, by the way, is very similar to a Quranic verse with one very, very major difference. The Quranic verse is found in Surah 21, Anbiya, and the verse number is 107, and it says in Arabic, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. In English, that means we have not sent you but as a mercy to the worlds. And end of quote. So now, do you see the difference between a Quranic verse and a hadith? The difference is the presence of the word sword in a hadith and the absence of the word sword in a Quranic text. So now, what does this comparison tell you? This hadith is very militant and the Quran is very peaceful. So the short answer to the question, is Islam a religion of war or peace, would be that, well, it depends who you speak to. If you consult the Quran, I think you will get the answer that yes, indeed, Islam is a religion of peace. But if you consult the traditions, you will get, and the work of the militant ulama, you will get exactly the opposite answer, which is that Islam is a religion of war. So now, who is telling the truth here? Who is more trustworthy? Allah, whom we consider to be the author of the Quran, or the narrators of the traditions and the work of the ulama, who are writing text that seems to go directly against the teaching of the Quran and also against the teaching that there is no compulsion in religion. Because when you are spreading Islam by the sword, you are very definitely compelling people. And this compulsion was evident in the practice that was prevalent, and it's even recorded. This is even recorded in some of the traditions, some of the hadiths, that when the Muslim community went out on this jihad al-talab, they would first invite people to Islam, perhaps accompanied with some explanation about the beauty and benefits of Islam. That was the first stage. The second stage was, and they would ask the people, the non-Muslims, to become Muslims. The second stage would take place. Now, if the non-Muslims agreed to become Muslims, everything would come to an end there, and there would be no further, tension between the two sides. But if the non-Muslims refused to become Muslims, then in the second stage they would be asked, they would be told that they can remain non-Muslims, however, on one condition, which is that they have to pay protection tax to the Muslim community in exchange for being exempted from military service. And they could, retain their religion, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or any other religion, I think. Now, I maybe have to be corrected here. And there would again be no war, and there would be peace, but the non-Muslim community would agree to be ruled by the Muslim community. So that was the second stage. Now, what happens if the non-Muslims not only refused to become Muslims but also refused to come under the jurisdiction of the Muslim community, meaning that they would also refuse to pay the submission or the jizya, the tax known as the jizya, or which is a exemption duty or a tax paid in exchange for receiving military protection from the Muslim community. What would happen if the non-Muslims refused to pay this tax? Well, the third stage would be war. Now, and they would be fought. The non-Muslims would be fought until they submitted. In this case, unwillingly, and they would be defeated, presumably on the battlefield, and then they would be forced to pay this protection money or this jizya. So now it seems to me that this practice, out of the three steps that I mentioned, only the first step is consistent with the teaching of the Quran. The second two steps clearly violate the injunction in the Quran that there is no compulsion in religion, because even threatening to fight someone unless they pay this protection tax constitutes a form of compulsion. And definitely fighting someone physically definitely also constitutes an even stronger manifestation of compulsion. So this practice of jihad al-talab, spreading Islam by the sword, goes directly against the teaching of the Quran and is therefore entirely un-Islamic. So we may well ask, what went wrong? How did this practice become adopted by some of the rulers? I don't say who practiced it or who didn't. You can judge for yourself. What we do know is that some of the rulers did practice this. And perhaps I can give one or two other examples of this. One example of this aggressive approach to non-Muslims can be found in the how do I put this, in the basically the way the Mongol traders and ambassadors were treated by the Abbasids just before the assault on the Muslim world by the Mongols. What happened here was that a delegation of 500 traders came to the Muslim lands, and they were basically accused of being spies and all put to death by a fellow called Inalchuk, who acted at the behest of Khavarizm Shah. They were put to death, and their property was confiscated and sold on the market, and the proceeds were kept by the people that ordered their killing. Now, this is clearly not in line with the teaching of the Quran. This was basically armed robbery and murder combined together. Now, how did this happen? How could the Muslim ruler at that time even think of doing something along those lines? And unfortunately, the tragedy didn't stop there, because when Genghis Khan found out about what happened, one of the traders, I think, survived, went back and told him what happened. Genghis Khan sent a delegation of 3 ambassadors, including one Muslim ambassador, to ask for justice from Khavarizm Shah, who was the ruler of that part of the Muslim land. Now, what happened next is just as bad, if not worse, as what happened before, because these 3 ambassadors were likewise put to death by the Muslim ruler. So now, is this the way to treat ambassadors who are supposed to have diplomatic immunity? And in any case, we are to treat strangers with kindness and politeness, and we are not to, and of course, murder is prohibited. So how did the Muslim rulers ever get the idea that this was a correct way to proceed with these visitors from another land? So I think the answer is that they really have not understood what the Quran teaches about how to treat strangers and how to interact with non-Muslims. So now, what happened afterwards was a big tragedy, because after a while, Genghis Khan decided to take his revenge on the people who did this to his people, and he came with a big army, and he sacked Baghdad also in the process, and he also sacked and destroyed a lot of many Muslims died. According to some estimates, as many as 1 million Muslims died, and the streets of Baghdad were basically flowing with blood. The slaughter was massive. And what I'm suggesting is that the Muslim rulers are to blame for this tragedy because of the provocation that they have perpetrated in the way that they treated the Mongol traders and the ambassadors. The entire incident reminds me of how World War I started. You may recall from history that World War I was triggered by the assassination of merely two people by a Serbian nationalist. That was the two people that were assassinated were the Archduke of Sarajevo and his wife. And this event triggered World War I, in which as many as 20 million people died. So you can see that this kind of provocation, action, completely contrary to the teaching of religion and, of course, also contrary to reason, has had devastating consequences on the perpetrators. So let us hope it doesn't happen again. In recent history, we have witnessed the attack on Iran and Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. Again, these were unprovoked attacks, and they had devastating consequences on people of Iraq and Saddam himself. He and his country was utterly defeated as a result of the intervention by the coalition that stepped in after he waged a long war against a neighbor, Iran, in which again a very large number of people died. So, what explains the poor quality of political leadership in the Muslim world today? That is another question I have. Why are there such leaders who act like this? What what happened? Why is this happening? Well, I would say that the reason why this is happening is because of that, as I said earlier, that alienation from the teaching of revelation and turning to other, basically man made sources for inspiration and for guidance. And these other sources, in the main, are some problematic traditions and the work of some problematic ulama. I could perhaps mention one other example. In history, the Turkish Empire launched two attacks against Vienna, again in a display of Jihad al Talab, and both of these attacks were repelled and defeated. And the defeat of the Turks after the second attack in 1683, the first one took place in 1529. After the second, attack on Vienna in 1683, that historians pretty much agree that was the beginning of the end of the Turkish Empire. So it is very clear that Allah will not support any initiatives at the political level where the Muslims themselves become the aggressors. In other words, Allah does not support aggressive jihad or jihad al talab. He says so quite explicitly in verse 190, Surah Al Baqarah, where Allah says, Allah does not love aggressors. In other words, we Muslims are not supposed to be the aggressors, not supposed to aggress against anyone. Yes, fighting is permitted. There's about half a dozen verses in the Quran which explain under what conditions, but only and exclusively in self-defense, or perhaps fighting against oppression, which itself could be seen as a form of self-defense. Never ever does the Quran permit fighting this so-called offensive jihad or jihad al-talab. This was an invention, an innovation of some of these bellicose ulama, as I mentioned, and there's a few of them, even among the leading Sunni imams. I won't mention any names, but you can find some of them identified by name in a book called Tackling Takfiri Terror, published by the Quilliam Foundation recently. I think the publication is only 2 years old. The authors are Saleh Ansari and Usama Hassan. The Quilliam Foundation is in the UK, and the editors of the book are the couple of chaps. One of them is Majid Navas, and the other one is Adam Dean. So on page 29, you will find in that book, which is available online, by the way, in PDF format, you will find the names of some of these ulama who have endorsed both the doctrine of the abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of verse 5 in Surah number 9, And also some of the yeah, you will find some of these names there, and also you will find, I think, in the rest of the book a very good rebuttal of this false doctrine of Jihad al-Talab. Actually, the book is an analysis of the jihad manual that was used by ISIS terrorist group in Iraq. As you know, ISIS also went and became very aggressive, slaughtering people left, right, and center who, among different minorities. And in the end, demise came to them too because they transgressed the limits of Allah, and they were defeated and pretty much obliterated. What we have now perhaps are just a few remnants of this extremist organization. And interestingly, it was none other than the leader of this group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who confirmed and is on record for saying that, I quote, Islam has always been a religion of war. So there you have it. Is Islam a religion of peace or war or peace? Well, if you look into the Quran, you will find that Allah Ta'ala teaches us that Islam is indeed a religion of peace. But if you look at the statements of some of the people that call themselves Muslims, like Abu Bakr al Baghdadi, you will get an answer which is completely opposite to that given by Allah Ta'ala in the Quran. Abu Bakr al Baghdadi teaches or was teaching the exact opposite of what is taught in Al Quran. And as I said before, he's not alone, but there's a number of other ulama who have unfortunately adopted this aggressive doctrine of jihad al talab and seem to have difficulty in letting go of it. So anyway, so that is so much about the question of is Islam a religion of war or religion of peace? Now, perhaps we have here the next issue is whether this should suffice for the time being to introduce the book, or perhaps what I should say a little bit more about how this the process which through which this transformation took place. We have two options here. One, I continue as I'm speaking now, or perhaps I will save this question for another video. Perhaps the second alternative is better because, of course, no one likes to watch very long videos, and that includes me. And so perhaps maybe I will just wrap up this video here by saying that we will look at that second, part of the problem as to the detailed, I mean a more detailed exploration of the entire process of how this Deen of Peace was transformed by problematic exegesis and jurisprudence into something that it was not intended to be at all in the first place, that is to say, a religion of war. So, having said that, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the space below, and I will do what I can to address your concerns. And in the meantime, until next time, we will see you then in perhaps the next video, God willing. So, peace be on you, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Thank you.